Uma, while we're waiting, may I just say thank you so much on behalf of Blacker for organising this joint meeting. It's going to be quite a thrill, and we're very, very lucky to have an extra meeting. And thanks, of course, to Gaetano and Michaela. So warm appreciation.
Thank you. I think I'm going to kick it off now because it's 6:03, and from what I've heard, this is going to be quite an event with all the time necessary for the actual team. So my job is very short today. Hello, everybody. My name is Uma Sudarsanan. I'm the Deputy Director of the Queen Mary IP Research Institute, which is housed at CCLS. Well, I say housed, though, to be honest, the entire CCLS is housed at home currently. But I'm also wearing another hat tonight as the executive committee member of BLACA. BLACA is the UK chapter for the International Alai organization, which was, as many of you will know, propelled by Victor Hugo and which led to the very first International Copyright Convention, the Berne Convention 1886. And tonight's event, which is jointly presented and brought to you by BLACA and CCLS, is all about video games and excitingly about how you can use video games as a means to analyze copyright law. I have to say I'm particularly proud to present this research work led by the joint team of Dr. Gaetano Demeter and Dr. Michaela McDonald. The three of his team, and it's a very large team, honestly, but today we have Salvo, Alex, and Mike. Michaela will talk more about the project itself, but just to quickly mention, they have taken the project up and presented it to WIPO and in other countries, and finally we in the United Kingdom get a look at it. And as a BLACA member as well, I personally think Victor Hugo would have been particularly thrilled had he been around today to watch this presentation. And the fact that copyright law is still having to cope with the impact of technology. And with that, can I introduce you and hand it over to Dr. Michaela? Michaela, shall I give it to you? And the event is recorded. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Uma, so much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. As Uma mentioned, this project arose from an opportunity when we were invited by WIPO to present at their first annual workshop on intellectual property management, a product-based analysis. The purpose of the workshop was to improve the understanding of intellectual property and management by developing specific tools for management of intellectual property rights. And we were there to represent the creative industry, video game industry, and we chose Cyberpunk 2077 that was just about to be released as a new an exciting adventure by CD Projekt RED. We took this standalone digital product and examined it from the perspective of intellectual property across its entire business cycle, both looking at the intellectual property rights holder and a user of third parties' intellectual property rights. And the insights and the findings are ultimately to inform the industry in developing more robust, more adaptive intellectual property rights strategies and policies, and to understand how critical academic analysis informs these strategies and policies that are in place. And as Uma mentioned, this is not our first time we presenting these insights. The project took a life of its own, and we are now looking through these events, through these dialogues, at where we can take the analysis next. And without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Alex, Mike, and Salvo, the PhD candidates at CCLS that have been working on this analysis and who are ready to present their findings.
Thank you, Michaela. Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Dunford. As Michaela said, I'm one of the PhD candidates who's been working on this project. With me are Alex and Salvo, and what we're going to be talking to you about today is the Cyberpunk 2077 video game. For those who aren't familiar, this is a video game that was produced by CD Projekt based on an existing Cyberpunk 2020 franchise of pen and paper or Dungeons and Dragons type role-playing games, which was developed in the 90s primarily by the company Talsorian Games. I'll be talking late in the presentation about how this IP was acquired and some of the interesting features when you're doing an adaptation such as this. In today's talk, we're going to be focusing primarily on copyright. That doesn't mean that there aren't other areas of IP that are interesting. There are, in fact, substantial overlaps. Trademark and right of publicity are particularly important, but there is going to be, some patent overlaps and quite a few others that will probably come to mind. So just because we're not talking about them today doesn't mean they're not important. For the structure of the presentation, I'll be talking a little bit right now about the role of the player in the game, and I'll be talking toward the end about the game's story. But Salvo will be taking the next segment and discussing the role of contract in regulating copyright in this context. Alex will be talking about copyright and the game mechanics. And then again, I'll be finishing up with some issues related to copyright in the story and interactions with third-party users. One thing, though, that we wanted to kind of plant as food for thought as we're going through this presentation is the question of the role of the player and the player's creativity in the video game. This is an area where there is not a great deal of settled law, and to the extent that there is, the view is that the player's creative role in the performance of the game gives the player no real copyright interest. What we've been asking, and we're certainly going to be interested in hearing what people think, is whether the law that has been established so far is still good law given the technological changes in games that have happened since then. Specifically, the role of the player, to the extent that there is case law, it's largely rooted in a single American case, Midway Manufacturing versus Arctic from 1983. In that case, the court said that, yes, the person who is playing the game can vary the order in which the stored images appear on the screen by moving the machine's control lever. I should say at this point, this is 1983, so this is law that's coming from stand-up, coin-operated video games, not even from home consoles at this point. That makes playing a video game a little like arranging words in a dictionary into sentences or paints on a palette into a painting. The question is whether the creative effort in playing a video game is enough like writing or painting to make each performance of a video game the work of the player and not the game's inventor. The court went on to say, we think it is not. Television viewers may vary the order of images transmitted by pressing a button that changes the channel on the television. Playing a video game is more like changing channels on a television than like writing a novel or painting a picture. The player of the video game does not have control over the sequence of images that appears on the video game screen. The most he can do is choose one of the limited number of sequences the game allows him to choose. He's unlike a writer or a painter because the video game, in effect, writes the sentences and paints the painting for him. He merely chooses one of the sentences stored in its memory, one of the paintings stored in its collection. that was Pac-Man, and that's relatively uncontroversial when you think about how Pac-Man worked. What we're going to be talking about today is a game that is many generations removed from that. So what we want to be thinking about ourselves is how much have these changes potentially changed how this law should be applied? Have we shifted on the spectrum to the point where we're now more like a writer or a painter? So with that thought planted, hopefully, I'm going to turn it over to Salvo, who's going to start talking about the IP components of the product and the role of contract in copyright here.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, good evening. We barely touched the complexity of what a video game is, actually. And the first slide, this slide is presenting you a map of the complexity from an intellectual property perspective is in video games. It's a complex work of authorship which includes several types of IP assets, like IP rights, mainly copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets, patents, register and design, and many other elements that we will look through after. What I want to highlight here is that many jurisdictions, they look at video games as software, given the necessary and inevitable software implementation. And from a business and commercial point of view, video games are actually software, entertainment software, which terms and conditions of use are included within a contract, a legal contract that we all know is named the End Users License Agreement, or EULA for France. We know basically that EULA, we all know that it's a legal contract. We have a very nice example of very nice EULA of the past. We have Apple was recommending us to not use iTunes in order to manufacture chemical or biological weapons, while Ubisoft was going very deep in asking to not use the software, in particular Far Cry 3, against the morality of the law. And another EULA was amazing. It was GameStation EULA asking them, basically they were claiming for an option for your immortal soul every time you were purchasing something in their portal. And if you are one of them, you draft with this EULA, please jumping in the chat because I want to offer a pint as soon as possible when everything is okay. Anyway, jokes aside, an end users license agreement is a legal contract which basically has different features. Clarifying compliance with the set of law like consumer protection law, managing and limiting, of course, all the potential liabilities in the context of a game for the publisher, and of course, ensuring a publisher all the rights he needs in order to protect his interest in the game is fundamental. But the point that we are going to touch today, especially because it's connected to copyright and to players' creativity, is actually that the end users license agreement establishes rules according about what you can do and what you cannot do with the software. And this is something I want to make clear. I mean, according to my perspective, in the EULA, we can see double nature in some way. We see clearly a classic and traditional IP commercialization tool. But at the same time, within the gaming environment, we can observe the end users license agreement as a governance instrument. Anyway, we are going to look better after this. And from a IP commercialization tool, I think actually that given the audience we have today, I think we can skip. I think fairly confident everybody we know what is a users license agreement. But I just want to point out that it's a revocable legal concept. What it means, irrevocable? It means that in this sense, next slide, please, Alex. Basically, the condition and terms that they are settled in this legal contract means that if we violate or assist others in violating the license limitations set forth below, you agree that we will not involve in part under any circumstance and do the following. So it means that there is a closed list of activities or behaviors in some way that they are not allowed, they are forbidden. And we can see that most of the time these activities are around derivative works. So they focus on the interaction between the players and actually the game content. So in order you can create a derivative work. The second set of behavior is about you can take the second slide, Alex, please. Another set of limitation is about the interaction that skilled players may have with the engine of the video game in order to alter or modify in this engine that we will see better after what it is. And they can alter and modify this engine, creating cheats, bots, hacking, and mods, modification and alteration of the game or the game engine. Another set of limitation is in terms of commercial use. Of course, using and playing the game in commercial establishment, for instance, performing some kind of activity like account boosting, power leveling. Then there is another set of activities which around basically it's very general, very involved in sports competition. So you cannot use the game for any competition, not cloud computing. Computing means not running the game in any other device. Not data mining, and duplicated items that it's actually exploit some default, some glitch in the engine in order to duplicate items in the game. All these activities, all these conducts and behavior, which are limited, of course, they look justified in some way because most of these activities actually they fall under the scope of copyright law. We basically want to prevent the unauthorized communication to the public of a copyrighted work. But at the same time, we find some conduct, some behavior that it seems falls outside the scope of a license agreement. For instance, the account boosting, the power leveling, and the application of items in game, for instance. This is because, in some way, this is how a EULA operates in the gaming environment as a governance instrument. And I would like to ask you to think in this sense to a EULA as a sort of self-given constitution, which has not been voted by the virtual inhabitants of the gaming environment. It's just there, and you need to comply with this constitution in order to live in that particular environment. And today we are going to observe, to outline basically how this governance impacts players' creativity and basically also copyright in some way. Basically, the end user's license agreement sets down a set of clauses according to which publishers own and reserve all rights, title, and interest in all data and content posted inside the game. Of course, after that, they tend to define very broadly what a game content is. And then after that, they basically express that, that you are allowed to create something except as, according to the condition that we permit. And this is something very interesting because this is actually an evolution of the last 10 years of EULA, because publishers, they recognize this phenomenon, this gigantic phenomenon, players' creativity, then they start to embrace it in some way. And these are actually a new evolution of EULA in this sense, because which are the activities they are allowed according to publisher? Which are the activities that do not impact the publisher's interest in some way? First, the first activity is basically you are allowed to use the game in order to have some advertising revenues, or permitted by donation or during streaming. This is basically portraying the current video streaming landscape of gaming. Then after that, they basically encourage you in their EULA to be creative as much as you can. So it means please be creative and please contribute to the community. As for instance, as examples I'm showing you with Minecraft, it's a very nice example where players can create very, very nice creation like this. And after that, of course, once they encourage you, they promote your creativity, they also tell you, we don't want to get sued. But if we spot a very nice project, then maybe we might be interested in using this project. And for this reason, we don't want to pay you nothing and not giving you any credit. This is something that is happening currently, but at this point, it is actually very clear that most of these limitations, again, fit the business per se, because publisher, they wouldn't be publisher if they don't have a copyright law or a EULA who actually protects their interests. But at this point, I would like to make two final points. The first point is that this current EULA seems reflecting a theory then the if value then if value then rights theory about a certain kind of creativity where basically we have a certain value here and there must be a right and somebody is entitled to these rights and then he has right to this value. But most of the time the type of rights we are talking about is property. That means control, and basically this is not totally, I mean, consistent with the nature of this kind of creativity we are experimenting at the moment. What I like to say is that gamers revolution. I like to say, gamers revolution. It's something that sees video game players and players as a not just consumer or user anymore. They are empowered. Next slide, please, Alex. And they are empowered, and they participate to the media flow to that extent that we can say that the production of a game is not concluded, is not finished at its launch, but it's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process means that it sees the contribution of two different types of creativity. We have the official one, the paid one, and the unofficial one, and the unpaid one from the players. And the first one, of course, is professionals, of content creators and game creators. And for this reason, I would like to say the point that the value here is beyond the property. Here, especially in gaming, especially within gaming environment, we have a continuous, gigantic and massive exchange of non-commercial non-commercial culture that basically can only blossom for an intellectual property infringement and contractual infringement. And this is something that actually is happening now. We are continuous clashing of this creativity with this current regime in some way. And the last point is just a final conclusion, is just to be connected with what Mike said about the role of players in video games. As you said, Mike, the player's role in video games is still decided by a video game of 1983, Pac-Man, that is not the most sophisticated example of video game. And actually, I'm wondering what may happen if the role of player might be judged and assessed from this next video from a project that I really like. It's called the Uncensored Library. It is a collaborative joint work by many players around the world. And this actually is a very interesting work because it has a higher purpose in some way. Because thanks to this library, players, they digitalized many contents and books that basically, and make allowed these books in countries where basically freedom of press doesn't exist. Alex, yes, we can have like a couple of seconds of this video.
Vorpx is a company which creates custom experiences and virtual environments within the computer game Minecraft. My team and I built the Uncensored Library for Reporters Without Borders. Minecraft is an open world game, allowing players to design and build their own worlds.
Thank you, Alex. So that's the point. Believing in a given player's role, it's okay, but we need to assess this role according to the most sophisticated type of video games. And again, I'm wondering what is the role of a video game player in this game, for instance, if this is something creative or if it is something moving sequence of images already pre-written. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Salvo. So when we talk about video games, it's important to keep in mind that we're not talking about a monolith of a product, let's say. It has different parts to it. So the following section has two major parts. In part one, I will break down video games into their two main components. That is the video game content and the game engine. And in part two, I will be using Cyberpunk 2077 to explain the different ways these components can affect the life cycle of the video game and how the player community is using them to add further value through user-generated content. The video game content, or VGC for short, is an umbrella term that includes all the individual works that go into a video game. To put it simply, it's everything you see, hear, or read while playing a video game. That's what generally falls under the VGC umbrella. This includes things such as 3D models and environments, music, sound, and voice acting, in-game and concept art, and so on. All these components may be eligible for protection, provided they meet the minimum requirements. Now, the VGC is generally produced by the creative department of a developer studio. Think of graphical artists, designers, animators, and so on. It is common for developers to license or otherwise acquire the rights to use existing content from other sources to create the video game content, much like how a movie or a series can be based on a book, for example. While this saves development time and gives the studio access to an established audience, it is equally common to produce everything in-house, have an original story, an original, let's say, narrative, and so on. Cyberpunk 2077's thematic premise, as Mike mentioned, is based on our Talsorian Games role-playing pen and paper game Cyberpunk 2020. CDPR acquired the rights from Talsorian to produce much of the VGC for Cyberpunk 2077. This allowed CD Projekt RED to use the characters, settings, environments, locations, and so on to create much of the content for Cyberpunk 2077 and expand the Cyberpunk universe in general. In that sense, Cyberpunk 2077 can be considered a licensed derivative of Cyberpunk 2020. Now, moving on to the more technical side of things, the game engine. So the game engine is a very important creation tool and a fundamental part of video game development. I think it's the most important creative tool in a developer's arsenal. A video game engine is basically a software program that's specifically developed for video game production and is responsible for things such as physics simulation, music and sound generation, artificial intelligence management, and so on. They are very complex programs to develop and are also independently protectable computer programs. A developer can choose whether to create their own engine or license one from a third party. And actually many independent developers or smaller studios that do not have big budgets usually tend to license engines as opposed to creating one from scratch. And it is also worth mentioning that an engine can be used to create various video games based on different genres, art styles, and gameplay mechanics. Now, CD Projekt RED developed its own engine called the RED engine during the development of their second entry to the Witcher franchise. They have been upgrading and adding to it ever since: higher fidelity graphics, improvements to animation, the ability to render high resolution textures and graphics, and so on. The latest iteration of the engine, the RED Engine 4, has been specifically developed for Cyberpunk 2077. It apparently makes it easier to develop games with a first-person perspective, and introduces various graphical upgrades for the next generation of consoles, such as the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, which are very hard to find, apparently. And apparently every aspect of the RED engine has been upgraded for this specific project. So CDPR, by heavily investing in developing, maintaining, and upgrading their in-house tools, has developed a powerful software creation tool that is customizable and upgradable according to their needs. This allows for increased creative freedom and flexibility when they work on developing video games. Most importantly, however, CDPR does not have to license or pay royalties to any third parties, relying on them for using their tools. So developing an in-house video game engine can be a long-term investment for a studio, as it can produce many games with it, with the only thing having to be changed being the VGC fed into it. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, the RED engine was originally developed for The Witcher 2. It was also used for the highly successful Witcher 3 and is now being used for Cyberpunk 2077. So it is important for a studio to be able to protect their creative software as much as it is important to protect their video games. They can also, for example, choose to license their engine to third-party developers, but CDPR has not yet done so as far as we are aware. And in a sad turn of events, I think it was yesterday, CDPR announced that a lot of its source code has been hacked and stolen by actual cyberpunks, And I read a news article that said that there was a dark web, whatever you attach to that, auction taking place today. And apparently source code for Cyberpunk, for The Witcher, for Gwent, another video game of CDPR, was sold for 7 million. So obviously there's a lot of value in the engine, in the underlying code. And there's also speculation that CDPR was the entity that bought the leaked source code in an effort to prevent people from gaining access to it, because it's a very important creative tool. Now, video games can benefit from a long life cycle, stemming from either expansions to the base game that elaborates on the story, the gameplay, and so on, something that CDPR has indicated that is planning to do for Cyberpunk 2077. There also may be subsequent entries to the franchise, such as Cyberpunk 2078. Or since the game is set in a first-person perspective, that is, you view the world through the main character's point of view, CDPR may develop a mode or a spin-off version for virtual reality. They can also introduce new game modes, such as multiplayer, that is playing online in cooperation with other players or pitted against each other. Again, something that CDPR is planning to do. Or you can use the video game content, they can use the video game content to produce additional works, such as movies, animated series. There's already a series, a Netflix series in the works for Cyberpunk called Edge Runners. Finally, if, humankind somehow makes it and is still around in actual 2077, CDPR may choose to remake or remaster Cyberpunk with the technology available at the time. Now, this is looking far ahead into the future, but we saw this happen with many video game franchises to a varying success. So this may very well be an option for a developer. It will therefore not be surprising to tell you that a range of spin-offs in terms of both audiovisual, let's say, and literary works have already begun appearing. Now, moving on to video game characters. This is Geralt of Rivia. He is the protagonist of the Witcher series, and he also made an appearance in 2 other video games by 2 different developers. Now, remember, we said that individual video game components can be eligible for copyright protection, provided they meet the minimum requirements. Without getting into too much detail, this also applies to eligible video game characters. A developer can then choose to license the character out to other developers and be used in other video games, just like CDPR did with Geralt. Now, when it comes to Cyberpunk, Keanu Reeves may complicate things a bit. Johnny Silverhand's likeness, a central figure in Cyberpunk 2077, is based on everyone's favorite Hollywood actor, which means, unlike Geralt, the protagonist from The Witcher, whose likeness is not based on anyone specifically, may present additional complications if CDPR would want to license the character out. We do not know the specifics of the business arrangement between CDPR and Keanu, but it will probably be more challenging to clear out rights if they had not preemptively discussed the possibility. Well, especially when Keanu Reeves appears as John Wick from the movie franchise in 3 other video games, Fortnite, Payday 2, and John Wick Hex. While John Wick and Johnny Silverhand are 2 different characters, their likeness and names are strikingly similar. They also both share, Keanu's now signature hairstyle and, face, apart from a couple of artificial limbs. These were also not the only video game appearances of Keanu. He appeared and lent his image for several other projects, such as The Matrix, Constantine, a 1993 video game version of Bram Stoker's Dracula. But out of all these appearances, Cyberpunk 2077 has the most realistic and accurate virtual depiction of Keanu. And this is quite important, as we will see in a bit. Now, these kind of IP transactions may be manageable when it comes to dealings between first parties. But the problem here is that they're not the only ones creating content based on their video games. And this brings us to user-generated content. Both the video game content and the game engine can be used by third parties or players for the creation of additional works, often referred to as user-generated content. There are many different types of UGC, and we don't have the time to go through all of them, so I will be focusing on video game modifications in Machinima. These works are very popular, and creators usually use both the game engine and the content for their production. So again, I cannot go into great detail, but here's what we need to know about modding. So a video game modification, or a mod, makes changes to the video game it is based on. This is usually done through the game engine and a variety of software tools that allow the modder, a person who creates mods, to access its content and make changes. For example, a modder can add new items to a game or change existing ones, add new characters, new gameplay mechanics, maps, missions, or they can also fix problems the game may have after its release. Mods are invasive in nature and can, in most cases, only exist within the game they're based on, with some exceptions, as we will see later on. So there are many different types of mods available on different websites, such as Mod Database. So you have content add-ons, gameplay mechanic tweaks, unofficial patches, graphical art mods, and total conversions. For example, The Witcher 3 has thousands of mods freely available online, ranging from simple add-ons, such as new stylish clothes for Yennefer, a character in the game, because some people care that much, to graphical art mods, such as the HD Rework project, that increases the graphical quality of thousands of in-game assets, graphics, and effects, a sort of a community remaster of the game. Now, modifications are not necessarily vetted by a developer prior to their release, and in some cases, it is very hard to control creating them, distributing them, and whether a user can install them or not. There are many benefits to modding, however, including making the game more enjoyable. If a mod is popular, then it might lead to increased sales because people will need the game to access a mod. They may fix things that the developer did not have the time to prior to the video game's release. And they can also prolong the life cycle of a game. For example, a good example of this is Skyrim, which was released back in 2011, about 100 years ago, that still has an active modding community and hundreds of mods developed for it each week. And some of these mods, as you can see, have more than 23 million unique downloads. It's not all fun and games, however. Mods can be controversial as they do interfere with the final work, and they basically alter the way in which the developer, or let's say the artist, intended for it to be played and experienced by players. On top of that, they can also cause some legal drama. Starting off with total conversion mods. A total conversion mod, it basically completely transforms the original video game into a completely new one. Modders use the underlying engine and the video game's assets to shape them into a new video game with custom levels, environments, characters, stories, and gameplay. Instead of using a video game engine from scratch, total conversion mods deconstruct pre-existing games and reconstruct them into new ones. A good example of this is Enduro, a total conversion mod for Skyrim that code completely changes the base video game, offering an immersive new world. The legal nature of these sort of works are a big gray area, to say the least, and it is highly unlikely that we will see a case being brought up to a court, because if a player has to choose whether to take down a mod or go to court and challenge whether they own the work or not, are not very high. And this brings an interesting question, which is the role of the player in creating and playing at the same time. And I think, Savo, you have a couple of points to raise about the whole idea of working and playing, creating to play, and so on.
Yeah, work and play, they seem very, very different concepts. But in gaming, apparently, we have something called labor that seems to erode the boundaries, because this is something that actually we don't know how to frame. This is not, you cannot frame labor as a job, as a work, but not even as a leisure activity. It reminds me the idea of a social factory where the production of something is just switched to the professional to unprofessional side of the population. And actually, Mike, as Alex said, modding is a perfect breeding ground for this type of kind of free labor, if we want to call it like this, because the amount of time, work, and efforts that people take in, especially in using and creating mod, it's insane. But I want to make another point, because this player's creativity is a controversial topic, because until now we have just talked about games, but there are games where players' creativity is just the cornerstone, the pillar of the entire game. I mean that there are games which have been designed just to promote and encourage players' creativity. In front of you here we have an example of the same game. It's called Dreams, and in Dreams you can just make realistic eggs, fantastic I think landscape, a sculpture, and a still life picture. This is pure creativity. In Dreams, you can do whatever you want. You can recreate whatever you want, to the extent that you can also play Super Mario on PlayStation 4 with the evident problem from an intellectual property perspective and copyright infringement. Another example of is this one. This is more a tool than a video game, but yes, it's a game in some way. It's from Google, and I would like that you can see this one and you can reassess the concept of the role of player in a game environment and tell me if this is not something that is more just than moving images. This is basically a 3D virtual canvas. There is nothing more. It's basically you can paint and draw whatever you want. And Dreams, this is a pure video game, while Brush from Google, they allow to purchase the software through a commercial license. They basically represent this kind of new vision of this free labor, because gamers and players, they love working on their mods because they're passionate about the medium. At the same time, there is some work, some hour spent there. And basically these Dreams and other instruments and other video games, these are perfect tools where players, they can create something, but as the last slide will show, basically it's their perfect tool to basically own nothing and control nothing as well, but creating a lot. And if you think that this creativity may increase some other capital, social capital and social and economic capital, of course this is not the capital of a player. That's the main issue. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Sab. And I also want to bring your attention to this. This is basically a player or a team of players recreating Cyberpunk within a completely different video game, Minecraft. They spend a lot of time recreating the Night City, let's say, the capital city of Cyberpunk 2077, so the whole point of Minecraft is you place all individual bricks, all the pixels you see in screen, one by one. And players devoted so much time to recreate an insane, let's say, insanely detailed city in a completely different video game. Why? Because they enjoy being creative. The whole point of Minecraft is to be creative, which raises further questions as to, the ownership, authorship, and all those notions. But now going back to our friend Geralt from CDPR's The Witcher franchise. So while Geralt officially appeared in 2 other video games, as we've seen before, he was also unofficially modded in 2 others, such as Skyrim. In simple terms, a modder extracted Geralt's model from The Witcher 3 and adapted it to Skyrim's game engine. So if you download that mod, you can play as Geralt, but in Skyrim. Now, before we talk about the next set of issues, I want to quickly mention that, and as some of you may already know, there's a Netflix series adaptation of The Witcher starring Henry Cavill. What you may not know is that the series adaptation is based on the book franchise and not the video game. What you should know is that there was a legal dispute between CDPR and the original Witcher author over the adaptation of the video game, which has now been amicably resolved. With that out of the way, this is Geralt from the video game franchise. This is Geralt from the Netflix adaptation. And this is Geralt from the Netflix adaptation modded into the Witcher video game. So if you want this version of Henry Cavill questioning your life choices, I'm happy to tell you that you can mod Henry into The Witcher 3. Now, the problem with this is that Keanu Reeves was hired to play Johnny Silverhand in Cyberpunk 2077. Henry Cavill, on the other hand, was not. Yet there he is, in his boxers, with a towel. So with mods, we can enter some very murky legal waters, let's say, and in some cases may rekindle old disputes. This can also go the other way around. What if someone extracts Johnny's highly detailed 3D model from Cyberpunk and creates a mod for other projects without Keanu's consent? Or still, what if someone creates a sexually explicit version of Silverhand's model, distributes it, and results in the creation of questionable content? Well, both of these scenarios happened shortly after Cyberpunk's release. Well, first of all, CDPR announced and released modding tools and modding support for Cyberpunk 2077 on the 27th of January. And as of now, there are thousands of community-created mods. On the very next day, however, on the 28th of January, a mod that apparently would let you romance and have in-game sexual intercourse with Keanu was removed from modding websites after CDPR's intervention. Silverhand's model was also extracted from the game and is making rounds online. The person that extracted the model noted that they decided to post the 3D model here in case someone else wants to 3D print or do some artwork. So you too can download your very own Keanu in a 55 megabyte file, whether you own the game or not. And some people are doing exactly that. They create 3D printed figures of Keanu based on the in-game model, and they sell them online. And by the way, the most ironic part of this particular listing is the royalty-free license notice under the price. So Silverhand's model was also made available for a video game called Gary's Mod. Now, I want you to stay a bit with me here. So Gmod is a sandbox game, itself created as a total conversion mod based on another video game called Half-Life 2. Gmod allows players to import custom content and use it to create even more games. Over 14,700 people downloaded and are using Silverhand's highly detailed Keanu 3D model for potentially creating other projects or other mini video games. So this is an area with, as Mike mentioned, has a considerable overlap with trademark law and publicity rights. So, and the last two bits before we move on to Machinima, I would like to bring your attention to, in a sense, a new type of modding. So Vorpx is a software tool that allows you to play first-person perspective video games in virtual reality that otherwise do not support VR. This software effectively bridges that gap and allows players to use their headsets and play almost any game in VR. The problem with that is that the industry has so far treated VR versions of their games as separate from standard editions. For example, Bethesda developed separate versions for their games, Skyrim and Fallout 4, and are selling them as fully priced standalone VR titles. Players are already using Vorpx, which is not free, by the way, to play many of these games in VR, including the original versions of Skyrim, Fallout 4, and now Cyberpunk 2077. Again, this is a legal area that is difficult to delve through, but at the end of the day, if developers will want to prevent players from using these types of software or mods, they will probably do it through an end-user license agreements or implement technical protection measures that prevent players from running parallel programs. But this is yet to be seen. Now, moving on to Machinima, a portmanteau of the words machine and cinema. Before we delve into it, I want you to watch this short video.
In 2077, they voted my city the worst place to live in America. Main issues, sky-high rate of violence, and more people living below the poverty line than anywhere else. Can't deny it, it's all true. But everybody still wants to live here. This city's always got a promise for you. Might be a lie, an illusion, but it's there, just around the corner, and it keeps you going.
So this was World of Cyberpunk, a Machinima recreation of the original Cyberpunk 2077 teaser trailer from 2018. And it was recreated by YouTuber Duran, almost scene by scene, using characters and environments from World of Warcraft. People who play World of Warcraft know that the game looks nothing like what we just saw. So Durin put a lot of effort, skill, and let's say creativity in recreating Cyberpunk within a completely different video game. So during Machinima production, video game characters are repurposed as actors, in-game items and objects as props, and the game's virtual environment as a stage, or let's say a movie set, for the creator to manipulate, compose, and direct in line with their creative vision. Then, if we are to define Machinima, they are basically computer animated works created either by using video games, video game content, the video game engine, in combination with a variety of creative software tools. And people are already producing Machinima based on Cyberpunk 2077, immediately after the game's release. Many developers welcome the practice of Machinima and mod production and encourage their creation. Their legal nature, however, may be a bit controversial. I prefer leaving this up for discussion, but before we do that, I would like to raise some questions for Machinima. Who owns a Machinima? Who should own a Machinima? And when can I play World of Cyberpunk? And with that, I'd like to give it on to Mike for the concept of play and how players are using the video game to produce more works.
Unmute, right. Thank you, Alex. So I'm going to start before we jump into the player thing. And I do realize that we're throwing a lot at you really quickly, but one of the things we do want to kind of convey today is that we are in an area of copyright law that is the Wild West in a lot of ways. One of the first things that comes up in creation of video games and things like this is, how are you creating the story, particularly when you're not building your fictional universe from scratch? In the case of Cyberpunk 2077, most of the characters and the plot are entirely new. They're CDPR's creations. A few of them are characters that were brought in from the old pen and paper game. And the setting is coming from the pen and paper role-playing game. But the thing about the setting is that it's quite close to stock for those of you who aren't familiar. Cyberpunk isn't just the name of a game, it's a genre. There's been Cyberpunk genre literature for several decades now, quite a few. For those of you who are familiar with the film Blade Runner, that's considered to be kind of one of the founding works of the entire genre. So if you're acquiring a setting, the setting is going to have to look a lot like Night City. So why are you going to acquire the entire body of this intellectual property? And a large chunk of the answer for that is that when you do that, you really do get this entire universe. But it raises the question in particular of, if you want to use a universe, how do you license that exactly? How do you obtain the right to do that? In the case of Cyberpunk, we've referred to it initially as coming from the pen and paper role-playing game. The thing about pen and paper role-playing games, though, is that you never have just one book. Releasing new books was kind of the original downloadable content for pen and paper games. So the Cyberpunk universe is not contained in the 2020 rulebook. It's contained in just stacks and stacks of books. So if they can pull the whole thing, they can draw from everywhere. Braindance, which is a key game mechanic in the game, comes from one book. The past history of the corporate war comes from a different book, and so on. So, first of all, you would want to do that because when you acquire all of the books, you acquire all of this stuff you can use for content. I scanned a couple of pages there showing on one page, and this is on the next slide, Karoshi Optics. You can pull that from one book. You can pull The Gang, the Voodoo Boys from another book, and you can combine these into your story. So if you acquire the whole, you get access to the whole universe. But the thing there is that we're not sure whether the universe itself is a work any more than we're necessarily sure, in the UK at least, whether a fictional character is a work. So CDPR kind of had to come up with an interesting strategy to get the rights to this. Ultimately, they cut the Gordian knot by buying the franchise lock, stock, and barrel from the pen and paper company, and then licensing back as part of the deal perpetual rights to continue to do the pen and paper games. These are the complexities that are running into the basics on this one. Now, moving back to the players and the player creativity, when we were talking before about things players can do, and I want to tie this back to the question of, is it a paintbrush? Is it writing a novel from the start? Like many video games these days, Cyberpunk gives you this built-in photo mode. We're going to play, we can leave this one on mute for sure. We don't need the trailer. I don't think we can go actually down to the example of photo mode in action on the next slide. So, yeah, and we definitely don't need sound for this. I was streaming, I streamed the game on Twitch, and I'll explain what that is in a minute when we talk about influencers. And remembered that this was on Friday, remembered that we were going to be doing this, and thought it would be good to run through photo mode and show everybody the options. The little chat lines that are popping up to the side are actually people who were watching the stream live and who were leaving comments on various things there. But you can see that as the player, when it comes to taking a picture, when it comes to creating a screenshot, you have a great deal of flexibility, not just in terms of how you arrange the camera, but also in terms of how do you set the focus, how much blur do you want in the background, and so forth. You have quite close to the level of control that you would need, that you would have if you were using a reasonable camera. If I'm going through all of this and I'm taking the photo, am I just playing games with, am I changing the television channels? Am I just playing games with something that is entirely owned by CDPR? Or am I actually investing skill, labor, and judgment, or creating my own intellectual creation in stopping things and composing a still image out of this? I don't think we need to watch much more of this. This brings me to influencers. What you were just looking at there was an example of streaming, which is one form of game influencer. YouTubers, these are people who do things like record background information about the game. So you might get something where people are showing you how does this background element fit into the universe of the game. And then you also have cosplayers, and we're going to definitely jump ahead and show that. But in all of these areas, we are really into copyright gray areas. We're also into areas where CD Projekt and other games other games companies need the influencers to an extent. They're part of the marketing strategy for the game. This is one of the reasons why I was using Cyberpunk's gamer mode or streamer mode to make sure that I wasn't accidentally streaming third-party licensed music without my own license. Popular streamers make a lot of money. They have millions of followers. They can reach 6 to 7 figure incomes. And we just have, nobody's really established, in part because of this question of who owns the performance of the game at this point, whether what the streamers are doing is infringement. It's a question that's not necessarily likely to come up, in part because alienating these influencers may not be good for the first company that tries it. There's been definitely pushback in incidents with game companies and controversial approaches before. And those would be nothing like what would happen with this one if they started going after influencers. There's still a wealth of issues, though. Beyond that, we've got copyright and trademark issues with the streamers. We've got a wealth of regulatory issues that we really aren't going to have time to even touch on. How much does advertising and sponsorship law come into play? What privacy obligations do the streamers have? And so forth. And that's beyond, as I said, the questions of, is the streaming legal without a license? Is it a public performance just of the game? Or is it a unique public performance? Particularly when you add the interaction between the streamer and the streamer's own audience. Is it making available? And then Let's Play videos are a whole nother different thing because they're not live. Are there differences between how those are approached, given the questions of fair dealing or fair use in the USA? We also have some overlap with more conventional UGC, such as the background YouTubers, which I've mentioned before, but I know we're keeping you a little bit late at this point, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. This brings me to cosplay, which is the final thing that I'm going to be discussing. Cosplay is basically grown-ups dressing up in costumes. It's got a long history. It goes back to at least the 1930s in science fiction conventions and possibly earlier. But it's also become an art form with professional cosplayers making up to several $100,000 per year in annual income from appearances, sponsorships, photo shoots, sales of their own merchandise, and so on. The slides that we're running through right now with cosplay are all from a competition that CDPR held as part of their marketing for the game. These are all people who are dressing up as characters from Cyberpunk 2077. And here there really are quite a few copyright issues that come into play, especially where people are not dressed up necessarily as specific characters, but more as just people who would fit into the game's scenario. People who have the overall look of the game, or people who are taking, as this person is, just the role of generic stock soldier from the game. All of these areas, again, are areas that are unsettled at the best of times. And in this particular area where we've got this underlying question of we've got very little law at all, and the law that we have, again, is coming from Pac-Man. Now, what you've seen from Salvo and Alex has shown you, I hope, that there's really a broad spectrum. Not everything is Pac-Man anymore, but also not everything is Minecraft. If anything is going to be close to just painting, Tilt Brush certainly is almost just painting, which Salvo showed you. Minecraft builds, as Alex and Salvo both showed, with their ability to just use the selection of blocks to create almost anything you can imagine as an artwork form, certainly would seem to be very close to paintbrushes. Games like Cyberpunk 2077, which are these large, what are known as open world games, where you're not restricted in the game to these little tiny areas that you can't go out of, but you have this ability to wander across a vast in-game landscape, tackle things in the order that you want to tackle them. You're not locked into you're not locked into the set storyline, and you don't necessarily need to get through the storyline to have a good time and play the game. Probably falls somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. But the question is where, given that the law doesn't even acknowledge the existence of such a spectrum at this point. So to wrap up what we've covered today, I hope, and we're certainly looking forward to questions on this, because I think probably we've done more to show that there are questions out there than necessarily that there are clear answers. These video games, even from within just a pure copyright perspective, much less a broader intellectual property perspective, are multifaceted works with a very wide range of legally unsettled issues that are coming into play. These include overlaps with licensing, and that can be the game company as licensor, or as we saw with the acquisition of the property by CDPR, as licensee or even purchaser of IP rights. But there's also the overlaps that Alex showed us with right of publicity issues, trademark issues. We could do an entire talk on and only barely scratch the surface. Many of these issues are quite novel and involve what we would have to call peripheral industries to the video game industry. Streaming, again, is at least a multi-million-dollar industry and potentially a billion-dollar industry. I'm not sure anybody has done the measurements yet. I haven't found them if they have. That's operating in one of these copyright gray areas. The YouTubers who are doing the background videos, again, they're their own ecosystem of creators at this point and are running in these similar gray areas. Cosplay, with people who are making hundreds of thousands of dollars, if you go on Etsy or any of the other kind of craft on demand, sell on demand online services, you can find huge volumes of cosplay specific things you can buy for your own costume. They're not just fan creation, they're fan industry at this point. So all of this is operating in areas of law that are potentially not entirely up to date. And again, we're certainly looking forward to hearing people's thoughts on how this comes into play and where things fall into that. So with that, we'd like to thank everybody for their time and attention and hand it over to questions at this point.
Thank you, everyone. Especially Mike, Salvatore, and Alex. I learned quite a few things from there, and I think I wrote in one of the areas, the questions to the whole team was, why am I thinking of the American doctrine, Senafair, especially when you all talking about the universe per se. And was it Mike? Yeah, you were saying Jean, he kept using the word Jean so much. And that's why that idea came up. So 2 questions. First of all, can everything that the video game publishers claim under EULA, if it goes to court, can it all be argued that it's an affair? Secondly, are you all actually advocating, especially with the last slide, that the problem is copyright law, and therefore, hooray, shall we all go into a sui generis area?
So those are, as usual, not necessarily the easiest questions. The first, my personal view on fictional universes is that at least in the US, they're probably protectable works, but that is also probably a problem when it comes to making sure that there is sufficient room for Senafair. And one of the questions that I keep bumping into and don't know how to answer is, how do you both protect the original creativity that has gone into a specific universe? And there are certainly elements in the Cyberpunk 2077 universe that go beyond what I think most people would consider to be the Senafair for the Cyberpunk genre. So how do you protect that, but still you leave the space to use the ones that are legitimately Senafair? And that's before we get into the question of, Cyberpunk's a relatively new genre, and did we really just come down to a matter of luck that William Gibson, who wrote one of the first novels in there, and Ridley Scott with Blade Runner between them, didn't try to clamp down on everybody who was starting to develop their own worlds that were quite similar to the worlds that were coming up there? As far as the second question, whether copyright is the problem when we need sui generis, I don't know that we need sui generis protection so much as we may need to question, in a sense, whether how much more we can adapt a law that was in a lot of ways evolved to serve as almost industrial regulation law when it's being applied to people who aren't participants in the industry and who don't have the background and the knowledge to interact on the level that the law is designed for. I mean, copyright law is a law that's designed for, at this point anyway, for people who are professional creators with access to lawyers. And we're lawyers, we're expensive people.
Well, you're wonderfully using the word designed, partly because David Musker has just written, CCLS Design Guru, that a lot of submissions on cosplay were made in the amicus briefs for Star Teleca. For those who don't know Star Teleca, it was basically cheerleader's costume. I mean, maybe David wants to say something. I am actually curious. I didn't know that there were submissions on cosplay in that case, which was a U.S. Supreme Court decision.
Sorry, I was just going to add something to the whole question of, as Uma mentioned, whether something is scène à faire or falls under the merger doctrine and so far. The question of defining genre boundaries has been the employment of these two tests, let's say, especially in American law. But there was a recent patent grant I think it was given to Warner Bros. For a specific gameplay system within a game. I think it was called Shadow of Mordor. And it basically shows that patent law may be used from now on to define what the boundaries of genres are. Because there are many other games that use, let's say, the gameplay mechanic that Warner Bros. Patented and should therefore, I mean, from one perspective, be excluded from protection because it's vital to a genre, which is sort of a nemesis system where you gradually generate a nemesis throughout your gameplay. So we see that a kind of a depart from genre definition, which was defined by copyright, let's say, to this point, and we see patent law being increasingly important in this area now. And it may be, in my view, a bit damaging because it may reduce the range of a genre, what can be included under the genre of a specific, let's say, game.
If I can jump in, Alex, I mean, I was making the same point about this specific patent because I played the game and I actually was kind of a concern in thinking that this specific way of, the nemesis system about creating enemies and vendettas about your playthrough, this is actually something we may stop the innovation in terms of, this was a very, very nice invention. And the fact that now it's protected by somebody, and it doesn't make me feel so optimistic in terms of how we can propose new innovation in terms of creating new social system for video games in this sense. I don't know, apparently patent law is helpful from this point of view, but at the same time, what Mike said, I would like just to add something. We came to the time that where, technology so clearly filled the gap of people who doesn't study, they didn't have the skill. So technology gave them the skill in order to be creative and create something in a gigantic and continuous way. And I think we reached the point that we need to realize that this is going to be increasingly important and impacting more and more everything. So I don't know if we need a sui generis solution or a general solution, but this is something that it's happening now. When I was mentioning Gamers Revolution, I imagine like an hypothetical dimension where gamers, they step ahead claiming what they think they should claim. And technology gave us power. And this power, there is something that we need to assess, I think, in this power, what this power can bring us. That's my point. That's my thought about it.
If I can very quickly intervene, Uma, I don't think we need more rights. I mean, we're fine with rights, a number of rights. And today we're complaining about copyright not being up to video games as an interactive, flexible, and fluid medium. But remember, copyright is the only one that allows us to have a constructive discussion, because it's the only one that is flexible enough to actually be an interpretation we don't even know what the work is in a video games, but we can argue what the work is and is not. We have noticed, because these studies expand into trademark, patent, design, and other form of hybrid IP. Those form of IP, they don't allow the same flexibility. So when something is, we can see something going in the wrong direction, there is no alternative to new legislation to fix it. While copyright, I think, has the advantage of being much more malleable in the interpretation of some of the concepts we have. You mentioned savoir-faire, idea expression dichotomy, work itself, and originality. And I'm not going to say anything anymore.
Can I pose two questions? David, I was just going to pose your question. You pose the question then.
Oh, thank you, Emma. Fantastic session, guys. Really, really good. Makes me feel very blessed in one way and very old in another way. Yeah, great stuff. A couple of, well, really, it was about the starting at the economic end of these things. And the question I stuck on chat was, do any of these developments, the possibility of exporting the whole universe and plonking it into a different platform, does that create a new market with no damage or reduction of the original market in economic terms, or is that in fact capable of taking away substantial amounts of the market share of the originator, the creators of the Cyberpunk universe? So that was my first. My second question, a parallel but in moral rights terms, the case that was started under design and trademark law many years ago about the use of tasers in Second Life, where the folks who manufactured the tasers were a bit saddened that their law enforcement weapons were being used to shoot down folks in Second Life. There's quite a lot of possibility for reputational damage by being able to sleep with Keanu Reeves and all that kind of thing. Insofar as when you create a character, it's potentially an extension or reflection of the author's personality. And when someone else can put that character into situations not planned by the original game platform, there's quite a lot of possibility, I would have thought, of reputational fallout damage. You know, that too is an issue with a knock-on to the originators. So those are my two questions, really. Do these developments, which obviously give an awful lot to the consumer base, the fan base, do they also have the possibility to do serious damage to the originators, or is it all benefit?
So Alex can probably speak to some of this more, but you're going to have to be satisfied, I think, with the classic lawyer, it depends, up to an extent. For the most part, certainly for the secondary industries I was speaking of, those are purely to the side. They will have potentially benefits outside the moral context, which is absolutely an issue. But they don't, streaming isn't going to compete with the game in any way. The background videos may conflict every now and then with the information that the games company wants to put out or their own take on it, but again, don't really compete with things that the company is doing. Alex can speak more to mods, but one kind of response on the question I would have there is damage at all or unduly damage, because there's always the possibility that a mod can come along for a game that is widely and thoroughly criticized, that is fixing the problems that the original creators have put in their own work. But Alex, I don't know.
Sure, could work both ways.
So, I mean, I'm just going to go back to the first question really quick to address that, because in my view, just the same way you cannot really draw a straight line from pirating content to quantifiable loss of revenue, I think you could make the same argument here. Just because people are playing, let's say, Cyberpunk in Minecraft, it doesn't necessarily mean that those people will have played Cyberpunk in Cyberpunk. There are many reasons for this, so that's why it's also hard to quantify it. One of them being, the simplest one, accessibility. Cyberpunk is a very demanding video game, let's say graphically intensive and demanding, and not many people have access to hardware that can actually run it. Whereas Minecraft is very simple, very minimalistic, and almost everyone can play Minecraft. So I don't think we can necessarily draw a straight line that shows quantifiable loss of revenue within, just because someone is playing Cyberpunk in a different, let's say, virtual environment. Then for the second question, when it comes to moral rights, well, I mean, first of all, I don't think there's much developers can do to prevent this, because in the example of Keanu, even though CDPR stepped in and took down that content, that doesn't mean that content is not circulating elsewhere. So if someone wants to go out their way to find a 3D model of Keanu to have sexual intercourse with, they probably can. What developers can do is try to suppress how visible this process is. And it definitely creates a lot of questions when it comes to moral rights. Because at the end of the day, you're interfering, let's say, with the, as we said before, you're interfering with the final version of the work. But then at the same time, that interference is not permanent. Those mods can be uninstalled. Some of them can be prevented by updating the game, making it incompatible. That's why you have online multiplayer video games that prevent cheating, because they can prevent cheating through updating their games. So at the end of the day, I guess it depends on how much harm it's going to cause, how much visibility is it going to get, because the impact is undeniable. There is impact there, but
Alex, thank you. I just want to ask a quick question that was given, and this comes up to pure law. Talking about universes, the question is, in terms of applicable law, does it really matter where the universe is created? And I presume you're talking about global creation with everyone who's a game player is coming from all over the world. So do we look at the EULA always in terms of applicable law? What determines the issues? For example, we've been talking about Senafair, and that's very American. Personality rights, very American. But if you take it out in Europe, it'd be very moral rights. So what are your views about applicable law? It's a tough one.
Basically, applicable law, of course, for instance, the biggest, if I make an example of World of Warcraft, is one of the most famous and biggest game. We have different versions of EULA drafted for different parts of the world, and it's actually it fixes a lot of problems. But something that is actually very controversial inside of EULA is the arbitration clause, in some way, which basically makes, actually there was a case a long time ago that because of this clause, the contract was recognized as unconscionable, but the parties, they basically settled the case, so we don't know what was the ending of that. But as gaming is probably the most international medium with the most international nature, and talking about applicable law in such an international environment is, of course, a very, very difficult. And arbitration clause and different drafts of EULA, they help, but they don't totally fix the situation. But of course, I think the main reason why we don't have case law about EULA and how consumers they challenge the EULA is because mainly of the arbitration clause and settlements attempts that they were very successful, because nobody were basically going to the court against a publisher for something in the EULA. They were just settled the case, and it's okay. That's what's happening at the moment. I mean,
I can just
sorry.
This is creating a lot of issue beyond this research, because EULA games are the strongest form of governance, except the arbitration clause that Salvo mentioned that has been tested in court, and actually after the case with Lidl Lab has been modified globally because it was too unfair to the licensee. No one is actually challenging them. We're seeing evolution of EULAs that are more user-friendly, but they're mainly dictated by outrage on social media by the player base. Probably on one side because of the culture. I mean, as a player, except if you're in Germany and you contact a consumer association under European consumer law, you wouldn't challenge it personally. But on the other side is that they're worded in such a way that, sorry, I forgot to repeat, no one reads them. So there are like 10 people that read the license. Even when something goes wrong, you don't go back to the license that then is connected to in-game guidelines and privacy policy. So it's really complicated to understand what the governance is. But on top of not reading them, when you read them, you realize that some of, for instance, the IP clauses are so extreme that I'm really curious to see a judge that will actually enforce it. But since no one is challenging them, they've been there for 10 years, for 15 years with the same wording. I'm hoping for a case. I don't want to be the defendant, but I'm hoping for a case.
I hope
if I could, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just saying, I hope you all are the defendants, and then we do a pro bono case from CCLS. Go on.
So, if I could take the other part of the applicable law as applied to the universes in that question, I don't think it matters so much where it's created as it matters where it's litigated, particularly when you're talking about infringement. There's actually a great example. Fictional characters, I think, are the best analogy to the fictional universe overall. And there's a case that was filed against Activision just last week in Texas, alleging that they've stolen a character that somebody put into a screenplay treatment that hasn't been picked up, but also hired a model, hired a hairstylist, took a lot of pictures and, made a calendar with those pictures and put them on the internet. Activision is accused of taking that and putting that character into Call of Duty Modern Warfare. And apparently the evidence will show, according to the plaintiff, that Activision hired the same model, hired the same hair and makeup person, attempted to get the exact same wardrobe. Now, in the US, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a straightforward case because you're just photographing the same things. But if you were to litigate that in England, obviously, with the benefit of having Temple Island as precedent to rely on, you could be a lot more certain of the outcome a lot more quickly.
And one last thing I'd like to add when it comes to the applicable, let's say, law here, there's been a lot of legal imperialism from the US when it comes to the video game industry in general. So that's why we keep coming back to US law, because there's has been tremendous influence from the US. So that's why we keep coming back to that question. What is more applicable? Well, everything's been influenced, unfortunately, no offense, Mike, by the US.
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, just also worth keeping in mind, part of the reason that there's some imperialism coming there is certainly the economic weight and the industry presence, but also you've got things, take notice and take down under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act has become almost a global standard. Most ISPs will honor them at this point, regardless of location of either party to the alleged infringement, because it's a quick and convenient and easy process to follow.
Okay, I'm going to round it up now because it's 7:30, and we all know that everyone who logged in today already had about 8 hours of Zoom. You know that, don't you? But it was amazing. Thank you for the slides. Thank you for the presentations. Thank you, Michaela and Gaetano, for whipping your team to do this. But I thought it was so good. And I'm really hoping to see a paper from this. It'd be nice to see a paper. Look, there's not much work. You just put the slides together.
Oh, we have the paper. We have the paper.
Well, that would be great. That would be great if we could put out a paper, and CCLS or Quimpri would be delighted to host the paper. Until Gaetano gets his Center for Interactive Entertainment Law, we're going to house it at Quimpri. But thank you, everyone, for coming, and have a good long weekend. Feel free to all these people can be found at Queen Mary. Feel free to email them your queries. Feel free to offer your creative images as well, or to get into the gaming community, which I think they would love. But thank you, everyone. I'm going to hand it back to Chris.
Thank you, Black, and thank you, Quimipri. And I'm really happy we didn't have the time to answer Alison's question on competition law, because yes, right.
Alison, you know what? I actually thought that's going to take another hour, because I had views on that. It was an amazing question. I was like, no, but why didn't you ask Alison to co-write something?
No, Alison, we will share with you, because there are so many potential issues.
I can imagine.
And your take would be very useful.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much from a personal point of view. And again, as chairman of Blacker, I'm delighted that we've been able to have this meeting. So thanks to all the participants and to Queen Mary for hosting it, and all you wonderful people for organising and presenting and giving us so much to think about. Thank you.
I had a line, Alison, on my notes, which I didn't say, but you know, the thing about the sign of a wonderful supervisor is their supervisee's amazing work. I mean, Gaetano Demita has single-handedly forged a new legal discipline. I mean, before him, there was no such thing called interactive entertainment law. And he's actually done the first law journal in this study. And I just want to tell everyone, here's 3 generations. Alison was my supervisor, but I was Gaetano's supervisor. So there is a line here. Both of us did well.
Wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.